discretion is advised.
What true crime case haunts you? The Andrea Yates case. Just the mental image of those poor children trying to get away as she was drowning their siblings. Also, the image of her husband keeping her constantly pregnant despite knowing she had mental health issues. He was quoted at one point as saying that he wanted to have more children with her after she was treated and released. If you haven't read it, the book Are You There Alone is absolutely heartbreaking. The fact that Larry Murphy is walking around free makes my blood run cold, and that of any women who are aware of who he is. For some reason, I can't link the wiki page, but if you wiki Larry Murphy, criminal, it'll take you straight to his page. He is a convicted rapist and prime suspect in the disappearance of a number of young women in the 90s, including an American visitor, Annie McCarrick, the first to go missing. While he was in prison for the rape, the disappearances stopped. In 2001, he kidnapped a woman, locked her in the trunk of his car and drove to a secondary location where he repeatedly raped and beat her. He put her back in the trunk of his car and drove to an isolated area in the mountains where he again repeatedly raped her and beat her. He was in the process of attempting to murder her when two hunters by the grace of the heavens happened upon them. They recognized him as he lived in the locality. He ran off, and they took the woman to safety and reported it to the police. Larry Murphy was arrested and pleaded guilty to rape and attempted murder. He served a paltry 10 years in prison. He showed no remorse for his crime. While in prison, he refused to engage with rehabilitation programs, and when he was released, he was just as dangerous as the day he was arrested. In the 90s, Ireland was rocked by the disappearance of a number of young women, 8 in total, all within a similar geographical area and all within Larry Murphy's reach. All of these disappearances have been thoroughly investigated, but no trace of the women have ever been found. Larry Murphy has been ruled out as a suspect in just one of these disappearances and the other 7 remain unsolved. It is widely believed that they met the fate that he intended that woman to meet in 2001, the one the hunters saved. It's suspected their bodies are buried in the Dublin Wicklow Mountains, but it's a vast area. It's wild terrain and nothing has turned up yet. The disappearances stopped while he was in prison. When he was released from prison, he was hunted by the media and he couldn't settle anywhere in Ireland, so he moved on to mainland Europe. He has lived in Spain, France and the Netherlands. Irish police work with the police in these countries, so they know who he is. He's been spotted trying to chat up young women in bars and visiting prostitutes. The police keep him under surveillance. Last known location was in the south of Spain, where he was working as a carpenter under an alias. It just runs my blood cold. The Otaku killer. The way he lured those small girls and killed them makes my blood boil. Thank God he was put on death row. For context, he was a child rapist and he would kill the children, strip them bare and take photos. Afterwards he would have intercourse with their dead bodies for days on end before they began to rot. He would amputate their legs and arms too as trophies. He was caught trying to lure another young girl. He got photos, but another girl saw and told her father. Her father beat the shit out of the creep, and he called the cops. The Ratman, one of his other nicknames, because of his hands, tried to run, but the police were at his car. He was arrested, and his face was shown to the world. The Boy in the Box. On February 25th, 1957, the body of a 4 to 6-year-old boy was found stuffed in a bassinet box and dumped in the Fox Chase section of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The child's body was recently washed, covered in bruises and lacerations, and his hair was recently cut. He was naked, wrapped in a tattered plaid blanket, and clumps of the recently cut hair was still clinging to his upper torso. Blanket in the box in which he was found. The child had surgical scars along his groin and ankle as well as an L-shaped scar on his chin. He was malnourished and showed signs of significant abuse prior to death. He was originally located by John Stachowiak, a man illegally trapping muskrats. John did not report the discovery, fearing police would confiscate his traps. Several days later, college student Frank Guthrum discovered the child's body and reported it to authorities. Police took the child's fingerprints, however they yielded no match. Over 270 police cadets combed the crime scene and found potential clues in a child's scarf, a man's blue corduroy hat, and a man's white handkerchief with the letter G on it. However, these clues did not lead to new information in the case. Investigators believed the child may have been the unwanted child of the wed stepdaughter of a man that ran a local foster home. Blankets similar to the one found with the child as well as a bassinet matching the one from the box he was found in were located in the foster home. However, no further evidence was collected and no charges were pursued. In February of 2002, a woman named Martha Orem came forward stating the child was purchased by her abusive mother from his birth parents in the summer of 1954. During the next 2 years, her mother allegedly physically and sexually assaulted the child until one evening at dinner, when he vomited his meal, which contained baked beans. M's mother dragged the child to the bathroom, where she beat him and slammed his head into the floor before drowning him in a cold bath. She cut his hair, stuffed him in a box, and disposed of the body. The details of Martha's story matched details that were not released to the public, including that the child's stomach contents contained beans, and he had water-wrinkled hands, as well as several noted injuries in specific locations on the child's body. Despite this, Martha was not taken seriously and dismissed as she allegedly had a history of mental illness. Neighbors of Martha's mother declined ever seeing a boy at the household, and the tip was officially discredited. Other theories were investigated, but subsequently also dismissed. In 2016, a facial reconstruction of the child was created and released, but yielded no leads. In 2017, DNA from the child was tested against a man from Memphis, but was unfortunately not a match. The boy in the box was originally buried in Potter's Field. However, after his exhumation in 1998 for DNA extraction, he was reburied in Ivy Hill Cemetery in Cedar Brook, Philadelphia. His headstone reads America's Unknown Child. City residents regularly place stuffed animals and flowers at his grave. It's been nearly 64 years since the boy in the box was discovered. Who was he? Who killed him? Could Martha have been correct about his identity? Will America's Unknown Child ever get his name back? Sylvia Likens. It just made no sense to me the lengths that woman and her family went to harm and degrade her until her death. It disturbed me for days after reading about it for the first time. My sister was murdered in 1984, and it's a cold case now. The most likely hypothesis was that she was killed because she was threatening to sue a dentist with ties to organized crime. He botched an oral surgery on her and tried to pay her off not to report him, but she refused. The police said a suspected hitman flew into town the day before she was killed and left afterwards. But there was no evidence left. She was stabbed 5 times in the torso after returning home to her apartment from work. Several $100s in cash were in plain view on the dining table. Alone she was giving her husband's cousin, and nothing was missing. I'll probably never know who did it, and the killer could be dead by now, as this happened in 1984. Shanda Sharer. It haunts me that she had to suffer hours and hours being beaten with a tire iron after being stabbed multiple times, then dying in one of the worst ways when her body was burnt. All that because she liked a girl another girl liked. Killing of Rennie Hartevelt by Isa Isagora. That man not only raped his victim, but ate her and kept her body parts in the fridge. He had multiple cases, and his psychopathic thoughts absolutely haunts me. Hard to believe he was only declared sane and found that perversion was his sole motivation for murder. He's currently living a long life at 71 years old. There wasn't much punishment for him. He just wrote books about his murders. Israel Keys. He would set up a murder kit ahead of time, sometimes years in advance, and then when he went back, would find a home that provided the opportunity. He murdered a couple in my tiny state of Vermont, and their bodies were never found. Bone chilling. Robert Eric Wone. Blows my mind that they couldn't solve it with so much odd evidence. He stayed at a friend's house while in a work trip and was stabbed to death after being sexually assaulted. The 3 men in the house were in a homosexual polyamorous relationship. They all claimed it must have been an intruder and were eventually acquitted. The murder of James Bulger. It's the most horrifying and tragic case to me and pulls my emotions asunder whenever I think about it or hear updates about the killers. I will never be able to forget that little boy. When I was a kid I had a friend who played at my house and I would go to her house for dinner. Suddenly I wasn't allowed to talk about her, and the adults were all acting weird. Then about 40 years later on the other side of the country I started reading a book about true crime. Gradually I realized they were mentioning my hometown and the area I grew up in. And then they mentioned my friend and her mother by name. And suddenly I found myself reading the true story of how her mother killed her father by poisoning his dinner. Joseph DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer. The way he would stalk his victims for weeks and sneak in and out of their house without anyone knowing, and hide weapons around the victim's house and his victims had no idea. It just freaks me out to no end. Glad he was finally caught. But it took way too long. He took and ruined so many lives and then got to live the vast majority of his outside of prison. I'm not religious, but I hope hell exists for ducking garbage like him. And I hope he has a long, miserable life of rotting in jail. The Oklahoma Girl Scout murders. The girls Lori Lee Farmer, Doris Denise Milner, and Mitchell Heather Buse were between the ages of 8 and 10 and had been raped, bludgeoned and strangled. It happened during a thunderstorm and they had been in the tent furthest from the camp counselors. No one heard or noticed anything. Additionally, the tent was partially obscured by the showers. The worst part is that, less than 2 months before the murders, during an on-site training session, a camp counselor discovered a disturbing handwritten note in her belongings. It said, "We are on a mission to kill 3 girls in tent 1. The director of that camp session treated the note as a prank, and it was thrown away. Jack the Ripper. I was really interested in history as a kid. Got a book from the library's history section about the case without knowing anything about it. Why my parents or the librarian let a child check that book out, I have no clue. It had pictures. Lots of them. The image of Mary Kelly is forever burned into my retinas. It gave me nightmares for years. Still horrified by it today. It's not a scary crime, but a man called Lel Hildebrand disappeared from a rock club in Sylvesborg, a couple of towns over from where I grew up. It was early 1999, and Hildebrand was still leader for the band Hammerfall. He, and a briefcase with money, simply vanished from the gig. He still hasn't been found. What happened is pretty straightforward. A feud over money went bad. The question that haunts me is where the body is. Then, of course, the Palm murder. He was shot the night my mother turned 20, and is a bit of a national trauma. The Dnipropetrovsk maniacs. 2 absolute psychopathic teenagers just went on a murder spree over the course of a week and killed over 20 people. They also tortured animals for fun. If you Google them, the first image you see is of them taking a selfie in front of a cat that they hung. They're most famous for being the guys behind the 3 Guys 1 Hammer video. Not one of the world-known crimes. My sister in her teens was attacked on the way home by a mysterious man about 10 years ago. She managed to escape from him. Mom called the police when sister came home and told for mom everything. No one caught that man and we never got to know who was that man and what he wanted to do with my sister, thank God. Now I always walk fast by that street where she was attacked, and I always look behind my shoulder. That scare will haunt me all my life. The torture and murder of Junko Furuta. What they did to her would make the cartels cringe. But the worst part of her sordid case is that all of the people involved in her death were given slaps on the wrist and are roaming the streets of Japan today. Elisa Lam. I don't subscribe to the theory that she was murdered or was killed by a ghost or whatever. I think she had a psychotic episode. The idea that you can just lose your mind like that scares me. That your brain can create its own internal matrix and fabricate a strange, frightening reality. The murder of Michelle O'Connell. The sheriff department mishandled the crime scene and the investigation and ruled it a suicide. 2020 did an in-depth story of it, and all signs pointed not being a suicide. The murders of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom. One of the worst crimes you rarely hear about. It's purported that the press was gun-shy as it were to widely report on it, being afraid they would look overzealous reporting on black perpetrators on white victims. I think those guys would have done it to whoever was in the car that pulled up. I don't think it was inherently a race-related crime, but it's one of the worst I've heard about, and I'm a long-time true crime fan. Lars Mittank, the guy who was last seen inside of an airport before running out never to be seen again. It still gives me the chills. I think he was vacationing with his friends and he supposedly had an altercation with a few guys the night before. His friends flew home, but Lars stayed because he was hurt by a punch from one of the guys. He was then last seen on a security camera which you can see on YouTube, and randomly started freaking out. He then sprinted out of the airport through a field and was never seen again. Messed up. Close to home. The family murders. My dad was one of the cops who worked on the case. He said many times over the years that most cops knew who the other people involved were, but without a confession from the one they actually convicted, or physical evidence, they couldn't do anything. Even closer to home, Gillian Jolmiga, she was raped, murdered less than 3 minutes walk from her front door by a piece of trash human being that had been released on parole for violent sex-based crimes against women time and time again. Not even a month before his attack on Gillian, he'd broken parole by getting into a fight and breaking someone's jaw, and he was allowed to stay out on parole. This happened only a few blocks from where I was living at the time, and I was very familiar with the area as I was there all the time doing the same thing. Gillian was drinking, having a good time with friends. It sickens me to think that the Victorian Parole Board dropped the ball so badly in so many ways. Otherwise, Madeleine McCann, I want to know what really happened. I know they have a new theory that they claim is really right this time, but I just don't believe it. Also, in terms of crimes, I want to know why the parents weren't charged with negligence, because without their negligence, that child would be turning 18 soon. John Bennett Ramsey, I'm 99% sure the brother did something on accident, but I want to know. In my sleepy northern Canadian hometown, a visiting young man went missing some years back under incredibly suspicious circumstances, and to this day everyone knows someone who knows something, and to this day he's never been found. Crazy part is, as small as our little corner is, somebody does know something. I hope for his family that one day they get some answers. Justice. The most haunting to me is Carl Tanzler, account Carl von Kossel. He was a radiology technician who was obsessed with a young tuberculosis patient named Elena Milagros de Hoyos, a generally grandiose person who didn't fully exist in reality. He convinced her family that he could cure her with experimental treatments. Elena died and Carl funded a large mausoleum for her. The thing is, he had the key to that mausoleum. He was convinced that he could preserve her body and bring her back to life, possibly by going into outer space. He'd created a strange contraption. Anyway, here's the really eerie thing. For almost 9 years, he refreshed her body with wire, wax, cloth and perfume to fill it out as she decomposed, basically turning her into a mannequin. Finally, Elena's sister, having heard rumors that he had been sleeping with Elena's corpse, and confronted him. Apparently he'd also been seen dancing with her corpse. Accounts vary on whether or not there was evidence of necrophilia. He was arrested and stood trial, but charges were dropped. He later created an effigy of Elena that included no parts of her actual body and lived with it. Phobhanstchuk. There is absolutely no way she killed herself by falling 12 stories down a garbage chute, not to mention that it would have been physically impossible for her to lift herself up into it and fall head first. She was 100% murdered. I've heard a hell ton of true crime cases. Paranormal, implausible, terrifying and strange. But I eventually forget them. But there is a few I remember vaguely. A story I have is of a case where schizophrenia and mental illness is at fault. Ed Gein and his brother was always kept in the house by his mother, who was highly religious and believed that everyone in the world was damned for hell apart from them. When Ed's brother had moved away and his mother had died, Ed had still continued to live in this house. But unbeknownst to everyone, what he was doing was absolutely unspeakable. Ed had a history of schizophrenia and mental illness, along with trauma from his mother's overprotective nature. had led him to insanity. Ed had rarely left his house. But when he did, no one suspected anything. When something had happened, the police had to enter Ed's home, and they found many unbelievable things. Lamps made of human skin, the mask of another human's face, rugs, clothes, belts, gloves, chairs. Ed had been killing people and using their bodies to make household items. Ed Gein had become known as the Butcher of Plainfield, or the Plainfield Gal, who was convicted as a murderer and body snatcher. A friend of mine killed his ex last year. I gamed at his house almost every Friday night for 7 years up until this point. Like, 4 weeks out of the year we wouldn't game, and half that was due to holidays. At first the group thought he was innocent, but as more details came out, like how the cops caught him, it's looking more and more like he did it. We won't know the details until his trial. That, and the fact that he had us at his house after he killed her, and after he was swatted for it the first time, gaming in the room he killed her in, is what haunts me. I had no warning he would do something like that. The Kellyanne Bates murder in the UK. I love true crime. I love crime related TV shows and documentaries, and I have done for years. So understandably I'm not as easily shocked anymore. But God, the things that this monster did to this poor girl. I cried. Look it up. Please don't look at the crime scene pictures, because I'm sure some of the pictures aren't censored, and it stays with you when you see the uncensored ones. Look up what he did to get over the course of a few weeks. This man supposedly loved her, and yet he did this. Truly shocking. The Thomas Brown case, considering it happened in a town not too far from mine. This is coming from being a parent myself. My heart hurts for the family who lost their son and is not getting any answers due to the corruption of the law enforcement there. It is absolutely infuriating. The sheriff seemed fishy as hell. Someone vandalized one of the signs asking for justice. I was screaming mad when they said that the case was closed. For me, it would be Chris Watts. He came home one day and then reported his wife and 2 daughters missing. A police investigation went on and they were still not found. A while later it was found that they did come home that day. They also said that he killed his wife and drove for 45 minutes to the oil field where he worked with the wife's dead body covered in the other car. After he got there, he got out and brought his children to the top of the oil tank and drowned them one at a time. Then he buried his wife's body near the oil tank in an oil field where he worked. There's a Netflix documentary all about this case. I may have left out details, so check it for 100% correct details. Click subscribe. If you enjoyed this video,